She was a virgin, invisible to everyone until he came along. He, a millionaire with a dark past, tormented by secrets and a forbidden desire. When one night he whispered, "Don't move, it will hurt more," her life was never the same again. If you like love and romance stories, watch until the end and you won't regret it. Subscribe to this channel and leave a comment saying where you're listening to this beautiful story from. Let's continue. Eleanor had been born invisible. At 23, she glided through the polished corridors of Davenport Holdings like a trained silence, bucket in hand, her steps soft, her eyes always lowered. She was the daughter of a widowed seamstress, raised in a neighborhood of stern faith in the far reaches of Queens, New York, where religion defined not only behavior, but also the size of one's permitted dreams. Her body was an unexplored land, guarded under layers of modesty and fear that her mother, Nancy, had carefully constructed over the years. Long dresses, hair always tied back, a gaze that never lifted for more than a few seconds. Her soul was a locked reliquary, protected by whispered prayers and promises of purity that had echoed since childhood. She had never been kissed. She had never dared to imagine herself touched by a man's hands. The very idea made her blush and whisper silent pleas for forgiveness, as if thoughts were sins that needed to be expiated before they could even fully form. Cleaning at Davenport Holdings was more than a job for Eleanor. It was a reflection of her existence, cleaning what others dirtied, erasing the traces of a world that didn't notice her, that didn't see her. Every day at 5 in the morning, she took 2 subway trains to reach the mirrored skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan, where men and women in expensive suits decided the fate of millions they would never meet. For 3 years, she had been just another shadow among the shadows. She cleaned executive bathrooms, emptied wastebaskets from meetings where million-dollar mergers were decided, wiped down tables where contracts were signed and dreams were destroyed. She was like a ghost inhabiting the world of the living without ever being part of it. But the world would see her, and it would all begin with a splash. It was on an ordinary March afternoon, when the New York heat made the air thick and suffocating, that Eleanor was working on the 35th floor of the main tower. The sun streamed through the enormous windows, creating golden reflections on the marble floor she had just waxed. She was cleaning the base of a glass partition, her movements meticulous and silent, when she heard footsteps approaching. She didn't look up. She never looked up when executives passed. It was an unwritten rule she had learned on her first day. Be invisible, don't bother, don't exist. But something about those footsteps made her tremble slightly. Perhaps it was the cadence, slow and deliberate, or perhaps it was the strange sensation of being watched. When she tried to move away discreetly, the water bucket tipped. The liquid spilled across the polished floor and soaked someone's Italian leather shoes. Expensive, lustrous shoes that were now dripping dirty water. Panic spread through Eleanor's chest like fire. Her hands shook as she bent down to try to clean up the water, babbling inaudible apologies. The guilt was immediate, almost ritualistic, a murmured plea for forgiveness with her eyes on the floor, as she had been taught to do whenever she caused any disturbance. "I'm sorry. Sir, forgive me, it was an accident, I didn't see." "I'm sorry." The words tumbled out, almost unintelligible, while her trembling hands tried to dry the shoes with a cloth that seemed inadequate for the task. She expected a scolding, the threat of being fired, maybe even a shout that would make her shrink even further. But none of that happened. The man didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, his shoes wet, watching her. Eleanor could feel the weight of his eyes on her, but she didn't dare raise her face. She continued cleaning, scrubbing, apologizing, until a deep voice, lower than she expected, cut through the silence. "Stop." The word was spoken without anger, almost like a whisper, but it carried an authority that made her freeze instantly. Her hands ceased their movement, but she remained on her knees staring at the wet floor. "Look at me." Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut. She couldn't. She shouldn't. There were rules, boundaries, a natural order of things that could not be broken. But the voice insisted, softer now, almost like a request. "Please, look at me." Slowly, as if fighting against an invisible force, Eleanor lifted her face and found herself face to face with David Davenport. She had seen his picture in the newspapers, in the business magazines she sometimes flipped through while waiting for the subway. She knew he was the heir to the empire, the man who would one day command all of this, But seeing him in person was different. He seemed larger, more imposing, with broad shoulders and a presence that filled all the space around him. He was 39, with slightly disheveled brown hair, as if he had run his fingers through it many times during the day. His tie was loose, the top button of his shirt undone, signs of a long and tiring day. But it was his eyes that left her breathless. Dark, deep eyes that seemed to see right through her in a way no gaze ever had. For a moment that felt like an eternity, they just stared at each other. Eleanor felt her cheeks burning, her heart beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. She wanted to look away, to return to her safe position of invisibility, but something in those eyes held her captive. David, for his part, felt something strange stirring in his chest. A sensation he hadn't experienced in years, perhaps decades. There, kneeling before him, was a woman who seemed completely out of place in this world of steel and glass. There was an innocence in her face that unsettled him, a fragility that awakened instincts he thought he had buried long ago. She had dark brown hair, pulled back in a simple bun, with a few rebellious strands framing a face of delicate features. Her skin was fair, almost translucent, with rosy cheeks that now burned with shame. Her lips were naturally red, full, slightly parted by her nervous breathing, but it was her eyes that mesmerized him. Almond-shaped eyes, a deep brown, filled with a fear he recognized from some distant place in his memory. "What's your name?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. So it wasn't something he usually asked the cleaning staff. In fact, he had never noticed any of them before. Eleanor opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She swallowed hard and tried again. "Eleanor, sir." Her voice was soft, musical, with a slight tremor that made it even more unsettling. David repeated the name mentally, savoring it as if it were something rare and precious. "Eleanor," he repeated aloud, and saw how she flinched upon hearing her name on his lips. "How long have you worked here?" 3 years, sir. 3 years. For 3 years she had been here, invisible, cleaning around him, and he had never noticed her. The idea bothered him in a way he couldn't explain. "Get up," he said softly. Eleanor obeyed, her trembling legs barely able to support her. She stood up but kept her eyes lowered again, her hands clasped in front of her body in a defensive gesture that spoke of years of learned humiliation. David realized he was standing closer to her than he should be. He could smell the faint scent of soap emanating from her skin, mixed with the smell of cleaning products. It was a strange and yet disturbing contrast. "The shoes," she murmured, looking at his feet with concern. "I can try to clean them better, or forget the shoes." His tone was sharper now, as if he were fighting something internal. Eleanor flinched slightly, interpreting the sharpness as irritation. "I'm sorry. Sir, I'll be more careful. I promise that—" "It's not about being careful." David ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she couldn't comprehend. "Just continue your work." He turned to leave, but stopped after a few steps. He looked over his shoulder and saw her still standing in the same spot, as if her feet were glued to the floor. "Eleanor." She raised her eyes again, and again he felt that strange impact. "Be careful with the buckets," he said, and there was something in his tone that could be interpreted as concern. After that he left, leaving her alone in the hallway with her heart still racing and a strange feeling that something had irreversibly changed. In the days that followed, David found himself noticing things he had never perceived before. The time she arrived, always punctual at 5:30 in the morning. The way she moved through the corridors, silent and efficient. How she lowered her eyes whenever someone passed, as if apologizing for existing. It started with the reflections in the elevators. David discovered he could see her working through the mirrored doors, and he caught himself spying on her when he thought no one was looking. He watched the concentration on her face as she cleaned, the delicacy of her movements, the way she lightly bit her lower lip when focused on a difficult task. Then came the casual touches, forgotten objects that needed to be handed over, a pen that had fallen, which he himself had placed on the floor to have an excuse to get closer, documents he strategically left in places where she worked, just to have a reason to be there when she arrived. Every touch was electric. When his fingers brushed against hers as he received an object, when he leaned in a little too close to pick up something near where she was working. Eleanor didn't know how to handle these approaches. Her body reacted in ways she didn't understand. Her heart raced, her breath became ragged. She tried to convince herself she was imagining things. A man like David Davenport couldn't possibly be paying attention to her. It was impossible, unthinkable, forbidden in so many ways she couldn't even list them all. But then the notes appeared. The first one showed up on a Monday, tucked between the cleaning supplies in the closet she used on the 22nd floor. A simple piece of paper with elegant masculine handwriting. "Do you clean what no one sees?" Eleanor read and reread the sentence, her hands trembling. There was no signature, no identification, but something inside her knew exactly who it was from. She crumpled the paper and threw it away, trying to forget, trying to return to the safety of her invisibility. But the second note arrived 2 days later, stuck to the inside of a drawer she was cleaning. "Your silence tears at me." And the third a week later, hidden between the pages of a magazine someone had left in a meeting room. What does a woman who has never been touched hide? This last one made her blush violently and run to the bathroom, where she stared at her reflection in the mirror, trying to understand how he could know that about her. How he could see through all the layers of protection she had built over the years. Eleanor should have been afraid. She should have gone to her supervisor, reported the harassment, asked to be transferred to a different floor. But there was something in these small disruptions of her routine that made her feel for the first time in her life that she truly existed. And perhaps that was what scared her the most. For years, she had accepted invisibility as a form of protection. If no one saw her, no one could hurt her. If no one desired her, no one could corrupt her. But now, for the first time, someone was truly seeing her, and it awakened feelings she didn't know how to name. She began to get ready with more care in the morning. Nothing dramatic, just small details. She left a few strands of hair loose around her face, applied a little clear lip gloss she had kept at the bottom of her purse for years without using. Sometimes she caught herself looking at her own reflection in the building's windows, trying to see herself through his eyes. And David noticed every change, no matter how small. He saw how she had started to walk with a little more confidence, how her eyes sometimes lingered on his for a fraction of a second longer before looking away. He saw how she blushed when he approached, how her breathing quickened when he spoke to her. He couldn't explain what was happening to himself either. He had grown up in rigid boarding schools, learned to dominate people and contracts, but had never known how to deal with intimate weaknesses. His relationships with women had always been calculated, strategic, based on mutual convenience or social advantage. But Eleanor was different. She was a crack in his perfectly controlled world, so out of place in that universe of figures and concrete, so genuine in an environment where everything was performance and appearance. And there was something else, something that disturbed him deeply. When he looked at her, especially when she lowered her eyes with that natural submissiveness, a vague memory stirred in the back of his mind. The face of a young, dark-haired woman who used to rock him to sleep when he was a child. A warm presence that had suddenly disappeared after his mother's mysterious death when he was only 7. The memory was fragmented, hazy, but there was something in the way Eleanor lowered her eyes, in the curve of her neck when she bent to work, that echoed that lost presence. It was unsettling and familiar at the same time, like a flesh and blood ghost that had returned to haunt him. The tension between them built up like hot air before a storm. Every casual encounter was charged with unspoken electricity. Every exchange of glances was a small earthquake that shook the foundations of both. Eleanor started having strange dreams. Dreams where he touched her, where she didn't run away, where there were no rules or prohibitions. She would wake up with her heart racing and her body on fire, whispering prayers for forgiveness that seemed increasingly empty. And David started losing sleep, walking the empty corridors of the building at dawn, imagining her there, imagining what it would be like to break down all the barriers that separated them. The storm was approaching, and neither of them knew that when it arrived, it would change everything forever. The night of the blackout arrived without warning, as great transformations always do. New York City plunged into total darkness on a Tuesday in April, when a failure in the power grid left the entire city blind. The lights went out one by one, like candles being blown out by an invisible force, until only the faint glow of cell phone flashlights cut through the darkness. Eleanor was on the 28th floor when everything went dark. She had stayed late, trying to finish cleaning a meeting room that was to be used the next day. The building was almost empty, with only a few workaholic executives still working under the artificial light that had now vanished. When the lights went out, she dropped the cloth she was holding, her heart immediately racing. The dark had always terrified her, ever since she was a child, when her mother would lock her in a dark room as punishment for any small disobedience. The fear was visceral, primitive, something that made her tremble and break out in a cold sweat even in normal temperatures. She fumbled along the walls, searching for her phone, which she had left on the table near the door. When she finally managed to turn it on, the faint light illuminated her pale face and her wide, panicked eyes. She had to get out of there, get to the ground floor, go back home, to the safety of her small but familiar room. She ran through the dark corridors towards the elevator, the light from her phone dancing on the walls like a restless ghost. When she reached the elevator bank, she pressed the button repeatedly, but nothing happened. Of course, they wouldn't work without power. She was trapped. The emergency staircase was her only option, but it was on the other side of the floor, through corridors that now seemed like haunted mazes. She started walking in the direction she thought was correct, but soon got lost. All the corridors looked the same in the darkness, all the doors blurred together. That's when she started to cry. Not a loud or dramatic cry, but silent tears of desperation that streamed down her cheeks as she tried to find a way out. Her phone battery was dying, the light growing dimmer, and panic was taking over her entire body. "Help," she whispered into the void, her voice choked. "Please, someone." It was then that she heard footsteps echoing in the corridor, firm, decisive steps approaching. Her first reaction was relief, but then came fear. Who else would be there at that hour in the dark? Is someone there? The voice that cut through the darkness was deep, familiar, and made her heart leap in a completely different way. "Mr. Davenport," she called out softly, almost in disbelief. The beam of a powerful flashlight hit her full in the face, making her blink and shield her eyes with her hand. David approached quickly, and even in the uncertain light of the flashlight she could see the look of concern on his face. "Eleanor? What are you still doing here?" I was finishing my cleaning and—" Her voice failed as more tears came. "I can't find the stairs. It's all dark. I don't—" Without thinking, David moved closer and gently took her arm. The touch was like an electric shock to both of them, but he didn't let go. "Calm down, it's okay. I'll get you out of here. The stairs, they don't work. They're locked because of the electronic security system. Come on, you'll have to wait in my office until the power comes back on or the fire department arrives." Eleanor hesitated. Going to his office meant being alone with him in the dark, and that broke every rule she had set for herself. But the fear of the dark was greater than any other consideration. "I shouldn't—" "Eleanor." His voice was softer now, almost a whisper. "You're trembling. I'm not leaving you here alone." He held out his free hand to her, waiting. For a moment that lasted an eternity, she looked at that hand, knowing that accepting it meant crossing a line she might not be able to return from. But as more tears came and fear tightened its iron fist around her chest, she placed her hand in his. The touch was electric, unsettling, charged with an intimacy that neither of them was prepared to face. His fingers were long, warm, and closed around hers with a gentleness that made her shiver. He guided her through the dark corridors to his office on the 35th floor, lighting the way with his flashlight. Eleanor walked beside him, still holding his hand, feeling as if she were floating in a strange and forbidden dream. His office was immense, with floor-to-ceiling windows that normally offered a breathtaking view of the city. Now they only showed a New York plunged into darkness, dotted here and there by the pinpricks of light from emergency generators and the headlights of cars still moving on the streets below. David lit a few candles he kept in a drawer for occasions like this. The golden, flickering light filled the room with an intimacy that made the air thicker, more laden with unspoken tension. "Sit down," he said, indicating the leather sofa in a corner of the office. "Do you want some water? There's a bottle here." Eleanor shook her head, still trembling, and sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped in her lap. She was damp with a cold sweat, her hair stuck to her forehead, her breathing still ragged from the panic she had felt. David approached with a towel he kept in the office for when he worked very late and needed to freshen up. "You're covered in sweat," he said, holding the towel out to her. But when she tried to take it, her hands were shaking so much that the towel fell. Without thinking, David knelt before her and began to gently dry her face and neck with the towel. The touch was too intimate, too dangerous. Eleanor closed, her eyes feeling his hands through the fabric, feeling how each movement was careful, almost reverent. As he dried her forehead, her cheeks, the corner of her lips, she felt as if she were melting inside. "Better?" he asked, his voice huskier than usual. She opened her eyes and found herself face to face with him. He was so close she could feel his warm breath, see every detail of his dark eyes in the candlelight. There was something there she had never seen in any gaze before, something that made her feel desired, precious, real. "I should go," she whispered, but she didn't move. "You should," he agreed, also whispering, but moving even closer. "This is wrong. It is. I've never... I know." The words died in her throat as he raised his hand and gently touched her face. It was the first time a man had touched her like this, with desire, with tenderness, as if she were something precious and fragile that could break with too much pressure. "Eleanor," he whispered her name like a prayer, like a confession. "No," she sighed, but she didn't pull away. "Please, don't move," he requested, his voice low, too close. "It will hurt more." It wasn't a threat. It was the acknowledgement that any touch between them would open something that could no longer be closed. It was a warning that they were about to cross into unknown territory, from which there would be no return. But she didn't move. She stayed there, trembling, feeling him draw even closer, feeling his hand slide from her cheek to the nape of her neck, his fingers getting lost in her hair. And when he finally touched his lips to hers, it was as if the entire world caught fire. The kiss was gentle at first, almost hesitant, as if he were testing the limits of his own restraint. But when she sighed against his mouth, when her hands clenched his shirt as if she were drowning and he was her only salvation, something broke in both of them. He kissed her with a hunger that had been building for weeks, with a need that surprised him with its intensity. And she responded with all the passion that had been suppressed for 23 years, with all the desire she never knew existed within her. When they pulled apart, they were both breathless, trembling, looking at each other as if they couldn't believe what had just happened. "Eleanor," he began, but she placed her fingers on his lips. "Don't say anything," she whispered. "Please, don't say anything right now." She knew that words would break the spell, would bring reality back with all its cruelty. There in the candlelight, in the silence of the sleeping city, they could pretend for a few moments that the outside world didn't exist. They stayed like that for hours, sometimes talking softly, sometimes just looking at each other, sometimes exchanging gentle kisses that seemed to whisper secrets even they didn't know. David told her about his lonely childhood in boarding schools, about how he had learned never to show weakness, about the constant pressure of being the heir to an empire. Eleanor spoke of her strict upbringing, of the dreams she never dared to have, of how she felt invisible most of the time. When the power returned at 5 in the morning, reality came back with the cruelty of a cold shower. The lights flickered on, the elevators started working again, and the outside world invaded the sacred space they had created. Eleanor stood up quickly, smoothing her clothes, trying to fix the hair his fingers had disheveled. "I have to go," she said, unable to look him in the eye. "My mother will be worried. Eleanor, wait." "No." She shook her head vigorously. "This can't happen again. It was a mistake, and was it?" The question came out more hurt than he intended, and she finally looked at him. There was pain in her eyes, confusion, fear, but also something more, something that made him want to fight for what had been born between them. "You are David Davenport," she said, her voice trembling, "and I am nobody. This is impossible. To me, you are not nobody." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. For a moment, she almost gave in, almost ran back into his arms. But then she remembered who she was, where she came from, all the reasons why this was destined to fail. "I have to go," she repeated, and left the office almost at a run. David stood there, in the middle of the brightly lit office, listening to her footsteps fade down the corridor, feeling as if a part of him had just been torn away. What neither of them knew was that they had not been alone. Helen Sinclair, David's fiancée of 2 years, and daughter of the senator, who financed a considerable part of the Davenport empire, had arrived at the building during the blackout, worried about her future husband. She had a copy of his office key and had climbed the stairs during the night. She arrived just in time to see Eleanor leaving the elevator, disheveled, with red lips and messy hair. And Helen Sinclair had not gotten where she was by being stupid or naive. Cold. Refined. A daughter of the New York political elite. Helen had learned early on that power is not won with beauty or charm alone. It required strategy, patience, and, when necessary, calculated cruelty. Her engagement to David was a strategic alliance between powerful families, and she would not allow some cleaning lady to threaten her plans. In the days following the blackout, Helen began to watch. She hired a private investigator to find out everything about Eleanor Nascimento. Full name, address, routine, family, work history, even medical records. Within a week, she had a complete dossier on the life of the woman who had dared to touch her future husband. Eleanor Nascimento, 23, daughter of Nancy Nascimento, a widowed seamstress. They lived in a simple house in a working-class section of outer Queens. The girl had attended public school through high school, had never had a known boyfriend, and regularly attended a conservative evangelical church. She was a virgin, of that Helen was certain from the medical records she had obtained through contacts in the public health system. A saint. A Puritan, exactly the type of woman powerful men fantasized about corrupting. Helen smiled coldly as she leafed through the documents. She knew exactly how to handle this situation. It wouldn't be difficult to destroy a church mouse who didn't even know what world she was getting into. Meanwhile, Eleanor tried to return to normal, but found it impossible. She could no longer work on the 35th floor without her hands shaking. She couldn't walk past his office without her heart racing. She couldn't sleep without dreaming of that kiss, of those hands on her face, of the way he had whispered her name. David, for his part, was becoming impossible to be around. Irritable, distracted, exploding at any employee who made the slightest mistake. He started working very late, hoping to run into her again. But she had changed her schedule to avoid him. Then the gifts arrived. The first appeared in her locker on Thursday, a small bottle of expensive French perfume, with a note that said only, "So you remember you exist." The second, on Friday, a delicate silver bracelet hidden among her cleaning supplies. The third, the following Monday, a book of poetry, with several passages marked in gold ink. Eleanor knew she should return them, knew that accepting these gifts made her an accomplice to something that was growing beyond her control. But there was something in these gestures that touched a part of her that had never been nurtured. The need to feel special, desired, important to someone. The book was her undoing. She spent hours reading the poems he had marked, imagining him choosing each verse, thinking of her as he selected them. There was an intimacy in those underlined passages that made her blush and yet yearn for more. That was when Helen decided to act. On Tuesday morning, Eleanor was called to the cleaning supervisor's office. There stood a woman she recognized immediately from society photos, Helen Sinclair, elegant, impeccably dressed, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Eleanor, isn't it?" Helen said, her voice as sweet as poisoned honey. "We need to talk." What followed was one of the most humiliating experiences of Eleanor's life. Helen didn't shout, didn't threaten openly. She simply explained, with the calmness of someone explaining math to a child, how the world really worked. "You're a sweet girl," Helen said, sitting elegantly in the supervisor's chair. "But you're getting into water that's far too deep for someone who can't swim. Ma'am, I don't understand it." "Of course you understand. David is a man fascinated by novelty, especially pure novelty. But men like him tire of their toys quickly." The words were like slaps. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but Helen wasn't finished. "He's marrying me in June. It's all decided. The entire New York elite will be there. Do you really believe he would give all that up for a cleaning lady?" "I never thought—" "Thinking isn't really your strong suit, is it?" Helen stood up, walked over to Eleanor and stood very close. "But I'll be kind. I'll give you an opportunity to get out of this situation with your dignity intact." What Helen proposed was simple. Eleanor should disappear. Quit her job, move to another city, vanish from David's life. In return, Helen would ensure she got a better job in another city, perhaps even a small sum of money to start a new life. "And if I don't accept?" Eleanor asked, finding a courage she didn't know she possessed. Helen's smile turned glacial. "Then you will discover what the elite of this city are capable of when they feel threatened." Eleanor left that meeting trembling, humiliated, but also strangely awakened. For the first time in her life, someone had considered her a real, enough threat to warrant personal attention. It was terrifying, but it was also a strange kind of validation. What she didn't know was that Helen had already begun to weave the web that would destroy her, and that David, oblivious to all this, continued to fall more in love each day with a woman who was about to discover that fairy tales rarely have happy endings in the real world. Eleanor's destruction began on a Monday morning, when New York was covered in a fine drizzle that seemed to foreshadow misfortune. She arrived at work as usual, at 5:30 sharp, greeted the security guard with a shy nod, and went up to start cleaning the upper floors. She had spent the weekend trying to make a decision about Helen's offer. The conversation with David's fiancée had shaken her deeply, not just because of the veiled threats, but because of the cruel way Helen had laid bare the reality of her situation. Eleanor knew the woman was right. Men like David Davenport didn't give everything up for cleaning ladies. But even knowing that, she couldn't tear from her heart the memory of that night in his office, the way he had touched her, how he had whispered her name as if it was sacred. She was cleaning a meeting room on the 32nd floor when she heard raised voices in the hallway. First came urgent whispers, then louder voices, and finally the sound of several people approaching quickly. The door burst open, and 3 men in suits entered. 2 building security guards and an older man, she recognized as the head of security. Behind them came Helen, impeccable in a navy blue suit, her face a mask of feigned concern. "That's her," Helen said, pointing at Eleanor. "Eleanor Nascimento." "Miss Nascimento," said the head of security, his voice grave and official. "You need to come with us. There are serious accusations against you." Eleanor's world stopped. Her hands, which were holding a cleaning cloth, began to tremble violently. "Accusations? I don't understand," she whispered. "A very valuable piece of jewelry has disappeared from Mr. Davenport's penthouse. A Davenport family diamond ring valued at over $200,000. Security cameras show that only you had access to the penthouse in the last 48 hours. Eleanor felt as if the floor were disappearing from under her feet. David's penthouse. She didn't even know it existed, let alone that she had been there. "I've never been to the penthouse," she said, her voice higher than usual. "I only clean the office floors. I've never gone up there." "The footage says otherwise," the man replied, impassive. "You were seen entering and leaving the penthouse last Friday at 9 p.m. "That's impossible. On Friday at 9 p.m. I was already home. I can prove it." "How can you prove it?" Helen asked, approaching with an expression of false compassion. "You live alone with your mother, don't you? And your mother was working late that day." How did she know that? How could Helen know her mother's routine? A chill ran down Eleanor's spine as she understood the extent of what was happening. "You'll have to come with us," said the head of security. "We're going to search you and your belongings. If we don't find anything, this will be cleared up quickly." But they did find something. At the bottom of her purse, wrapped in a dark cloth she had never seen before, was the ring. A magnificent ring, with a central diamond that sparkled even under the fluorescent lights of the room, surrounded by smaller diamonds in an antique and elaborate setting. Eleanor stared at the jewel as if it were a venomous snake. Her legs gave out and she held onto the table to keep from falling. "I've never seen this before in my life," she whispered, the words coming out ragged as she struggled to breathe. "Someone put this in my purse. I swear to God I never—" "Ma'am," said the head of security, with a tone that mixed professionalism and contempt, "you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you." What followed was a slow-motion nightmare. Eleanor was taken to a closed room, where she was forced to strip completely for a humiliating body search. Her clothes were turned inside out, every seam examined. They asked questions about her personal life, her spending habits, questioning how a cleaning lady could afford the perfume she wore. The bracelet on her wrist. "They were gifts," she explained, the tears finally coming. "I don't know from whom, but—" "Anonymous gifts?" The interrogator laughed cruelly. "How convenient! And I suppose you have no way to prove that." She didn't. The notes had been thrown away, the gifts hadn't come with identifying cards. Everything had been planned to look exactly as it did now. A greedy employee who had gotten involved with her boss and was being bought with expensive gifts. When they finally released her, after hours of questioning, Eleanor was completely broken. Her clothes were wrinkled, her hair disheveled, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She walked through the corridors like a ghost, followed by the curious stares and malicious whispers of other employees. The news spread through the building like wildfire. The cleaning lady who tried to steal a jewel from the Davenport family. Some employees who had always been kind to her now avoided her as if she were contagious. Others looked at her with a mixture of disgust and satisfaction, as if she were finally being put in her place. David only found out what had happened late in the afternoon when he returned from an off-site meeting. He found Helen in his office, drinking champagne and looking strangely pleased. "What's the celebration?" he asked, loosening his tie and pouring himself a whiskey. "Oh, darling," Helen sighed as if it were a great sorrow. "I had to deal with a very unpleasant situation today. One of the cleaning staff tried to steal your grandmother's ring." David stopped with the glass halfway to his mouth. "What ring?" "What staff member?" "The diamond ring that belonged to your maternal grandmother. It was in the safe in the penthouse. A woman named Eleanor Nascimento somehow got access and—" The whiskey glass shattered on the floor. David turned to Helen with an expression she had never seen before, a cold fury that made her instinctively recoil. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Me? Darling, I was just protecting our interests. Security found the ring in her purse, the cameras showed. Cameras can be manipulated. Where is the original footage?" Helen blinked, trying to maintain her composure. "I don't know what you're talking about. Why would you protect a thief?" But David was already leaving the office, running towards the elevators. He had to find Eleanor, had to explain, had to find a way to undo this horrible lie. When he reached the floor where she worked, he found only her supervisor, gathering the belongings left in her locker. "Where is she?" he asked without preamble. The older woman looked at him with a mixture of pity and disapproval. "She's gone, Mr. Davenport, after what happened today." "Well, we couldn't keep her working here. Her reputation. Where did she go?" "I don't know, sir. She just ran out after they released her." David felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. Eleanor had left there humiliated, destroyed, believing he was behind it all. When he tried to call her, he discovered the number he had was no longer in service. When he went to the address he got from Human Resources, he found the house empty, with a "For Rent" sign in the front. Helen had been very efficient. She had not only destroyed Eleanor professionally, but she had ensured that she disappeared completely. What Helen hadn't counted on was the press. The story hit the papers 3 days later. Davenport heir involved in scandal with employee. Eleanor's photo, clearly taken from security cameras in a moment of desperation, was plastered across the tabloids next to old photos of David at social events. The text was cruel and sensationalist. It spoke of a humble employee who allegedly became romantically involved with the millionaire heir, attempting to steal a family jewel when she realized she was being discarded. There were insinuations about her personal life, about her purity having been corrupted by greed. Eleanor saw the report at her cousin's house in upstate New York, where she had taken refuge with her mother after fleeing the city in the middle of the night. She was helping take clothes off the line when her cousin came running with the newspaper in hand. "Eleanor, you have to see this." When she saw her photo on the front page with the headline, "The Cinderella Who Became a Thief," Eleanor collapsed. She cried as she had never cried before, a cry that came from a deep place in her soul, where humiliation and betrayal mixed with a pain that seemed to have no end. Her mother, Nancy, held her in her arms as she had when she was a child, but there was something in the older woman's eyes that Eleanor couldn't decipher. A guilt, a fear, as if this situation had awakened ghosts from the past. "My daughter," Nancy whispered, stroking her daughter's hair. "My daughter, this will pass. We'll go far away from here, we'll start over." But Eleanor didn't want to run anymore. Something had broken inside her during that public humiliation, but it wasn't just shame. It was an awakening. For the first time in her life, she was furious. Furious with Helen, furious with David for not defending her, furious with herself for having been so naive. "We're not running," she said, drying her tears and standing up with a determination that surprised her mother. "I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not going to hide as if I'm guilty." Tired of obeying, she cut her long hair in a cheap salon in town. The modern barb framed her face in a way she had never experienced, giving her a more mature, more confident appearance. She traded her conservative clothes for jeans and more fitted blouses that she had bought with her last paycheck. She started studying at night, preparing for the entrance exams for a state college. It was on one of those study nights, at the small town's public library, that she met Ethan. He was a recently graduated, idealistic lawyer who had come to the countryside to work at a firm that provided free legal aid to low-income people. Tall, thin, with curly hair and glasses that gave him an intellectual air, Ethan was kind in a way Eleanor had never experienced. The first time they spoke was when she was struggling with a constitutional law book, trying to understand concepts for an essay she was writing. He offered to help, and when she explained she was studying to apply for a journalism program, he was genuinely interested. Journalism? What field? Investigative, she replied, surprising herself with the firmness of her answer. I want to expose the truth about people who think they can do anything because they have money and power. There was an intensity in her eyes that caught Ethan's attention. This was not the typical small-town girl dreaming of a glamorous career. There was something deeper there, a wound that had turned into a purpose. They started meeting regularly at the library. He helped her with her studies. She helped him better understand the reality of the simple people he served in his work. There was an intellectual connection between them, a mutual respect that grew with each conversation. Ethan was gentle, respectful, interested in her not as a scandal or a curiosity, but as a woman. When he finally asked her to dinner, it was with the adorable hesitation of someone who isn't sure if he's being too forward. I'd love to, Eleanor replied, and for the first time in months, she truly smiled. The relationship that developed between them was completely different from anything she had experienced with David. There wasn't the electric tension, the constant danger, the feeling of walking on fire. With Ethan there was peace, stability, long conversations about books and social justice, sweet kisses that didn't make her tremble with uncontrollable desire. For the first time, Eleanor found herself desired with respect. Ethan courted her like a lady, asked for permission before kissing her, talked about introducing her to his family, about plans for the future. It was everything a sensible woman should want. But the nights were difficult. When she was alone in the dark, the memories returned. David's hands on her face, the way he had whispered her name, the desire she had felt in that candle-lit office. And then came the anger, the pain of betrayal, the humiliation of discovering she had been just a pastime for a rich, bored man. She tried to love Ethan. God knew how she tried. He deserved to be loved, deserved a woman who would return his devotion with the same intensity. But she couldn't, because inside her the echo of David still burned like a wound that refused to heal. Meanwhile in New York, the Davenport empire was beginning to crumble. It had started with small internal sabotages, important contracts mysteriously lost to competitors, leaks of confidential information, key employees suddenly resigning. David had lost control of the company, of the people around him, of himself. He had hired private investigators to find Eleanor, to prove her innocence. But she had vanished like smoke. Her mother had changed her name, left no trace, as if they had both been erased from the face of the earth. He began to drink more, sleep less, explode at employees for insignificant reasons. His meetings with shareholders became battlefields, where he fought to maintain control of a company that seemed to be disintegrating from within. Helen tried to get closer, offering support and understanding, but David avoided her as if she were toxic. He knew she had something to do with what had happened to Eleanor, but he couldn't prove anything. The evidence was too solid, too well constructed. That's when the dossier arrived. A plain manila envelope with no return address was left on David's desk on a Monday morning. Inside were old documents, photocopies of employee records from the 90s, yellowed photos, and a letter that would change everything. The name that jumped from the pages was like a punch to the stomach: Nancy Nascimento. The same Nancy who was Eleanor's mother. In the documents, she was listed as an employee of the Davenport family between 1995 and 1999, not as a seamstress, as she had always told her daughter, but as a nanny. Nanny to young David Davenport. The photographs showed a young, beautiful woman with almond-shaped eyes and a sweet smile, holding a blonde child with curly hair. David recognized himself immediately in the photo. He must have been 7 or 8. But it was the last photo that stopped his heart. Nancy was pregnant, visibly pregnant, in a photo dated March 1999. Eleanor had been born in September 1999. The doubt fell like poison into his blood. Were they half-siblings? Were they connected by a forbidden blood tie? Had they committed emotional incest without knowing it? The letter accompanying the documents offered no answers, only more questions. It was written in a shaky feminine hand and said only, "The truth about Nancy Nascimento is buried with your mistress. Look for the records from 1999. Find out why she left so suddenly." David locked his office and spent the rest of the day searching through the family archives. He found financial records, payrolls, even some old photos stored in dusty boxes in the attic of the family mansion. It was there that he found his mother's album. Pages and pages of photos from his childhood, always accompanied by the warm presence of Nancy. She appeared in dozens of photos, helping him get dressed, reading him stories, playing in the garden. There was an intimacy in those images that spoke of much more than a simple working relationship. And there was something else. In several photos, his biological mother appeared in the background, always distant, always cold, looking at Nancy and him with an expression David now recognized as jealousy. On the last page of the album, he found a photo that stopped his heart. His mother, Nancy, and him at a birthday party. His mother was holding a cake, but she was staring intently at Nancy, who was holding David on her lap. The hatred in his mother's eyes was palpable, even after so many years. The photo was from August 1999. His mother died in September, and Nancy disappeared shortly after the funeral. The truth began to form in his mind, terrible and inescapable, but he needed more proof. He had to be sure before confronting ghosts that could destroy what was left of his world. What David didn't know was that the same questions were being asked 250 miles away, in a small upstate town, where Eleanor was pressing her mother for answers that Nancy didn't want to give, and that the truth, when it finally came to light, would be even more disturbing than any of them could imagine. The letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday in June, 6 months after Eleanor had disappeared from New York City. She was working as a caregiver in a nursing home in the small upstate town, a job she had gotten through Ethan, when the director called her to receive a piece of mail that had arrived in her name. The envelope was plain, with no return address, but when Eleanor saw the handwriting on the address, her heart stopped. It was David's writing. She would recognize that script anywhere, after all the notes she had received. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope away from the prying eyes of other employees. Inside were just a few handwritten lines. "Eleanor, I need to talk to you. I've discovered things about your mother's past that could change everything. You are in danger. Don't trust anyone until we talk. Please meet me at the Central Cafe in a town in the Catskills on Saturday at 3 p.m. Come alone, David." Eleanor's first reaction was to tear up the letter, to throw away those words that reopened wounds she was desperately trying to heal. David Davenport no longer had the right to enter her life, to disturb her with his discoveries and his requests for a meeting. But the words, "You are in danger," echoed disturbingly in her mind. And there was something in the tone of the letter, an urgency that went beyond personal desire, that made her hesitate. When she got home that night, she found her mother sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Nancy had been strange for weeks, distant, as if she were constantly waiting for something bad to happen. "Mom," Eleanor said, sitting down beside her, "we need to talk." Nancy looked up, and Eleanor saw a fear there that she had never noticed before, an old deep-seated fear that seemed to have been part of the woman's soul for many years. "About what, dear?" "About our past. About why we left New York the first time. About why you never talk about my father. About the Davenport family." The cup slipped from Nancy's hands and shattered on the floor. The noise echoed in the small kitchen like a gunshot, but neither of them moved to clean up the shards. "I don't know what you're talking about," Nancy whispered, but her hands were shaking violently. "Mom, please. I know you're lying. I've always known. The way you react whenever someone mentions that name. How terrified you were when you found out where I was working. Eleanor, some things are better left in the past. But the past doesn't want to stay behind." Eleanor exploded, standing up abruptly. "It's here, destroying our lives, destroying any chance I might have of being happy. That's when Nancy began to cry. Not a soft cry of sadness, but desperate sobs from someone who had carried a secret too heavy for too long. "You don't understand," she sobbed. "You have no idea what that family is capable of. What she did to me." "Then tell me. Explain it to me so I can understand." Nancy looked at her daughter for a long moment, as if weighing the pros and cons of opening a door she had kept locked for over 20 years. Finally, she took a deep breath and gestured to the chair. "Sit down. This is going to take a while." The story Nancy told that night changed everything Eleanor thought she knew about her own life. Nancy had started working for the Davenport family in 1995. When she was just 18, she was an orphan, raised in a religious orphanage, and got the job as a nanny through the nuns who had raised her. The job was to care for little David, who was 7 at the time and had just lost his father in a car accident. "He was such a lonely child," Nancy recounted, her eyes lost in memories. "His mother, Diana Davenport, was cold, distant. She treated the boy more like a burden than a son. She started to hate me when she realized David was getting attached to me. For 4 years, Nancy practically raised David. She took him to school, helped with his homework, read him stories before bed, comforted him when he had nightmares. She was the one who knew his fears, his dreams, his small joys." "Diana didn't like how close you two were?" Eleanor asked. "She hated me. She said I was spoiling the boy too much, that I was making him weak. But what bothered her most was that David called me mommy when he was sad or scared. In 1999, the situation reached a breaking point. Diana discovered that Nancy was pregnant. Pregnant with whom?" Eleanor asked, though a part of her already feared the answer. "With a man named Abel. He was a distant cousin of the Davenports, worked at the company. We met at a family party and, well, I was young, he was handsome. He promised he would marry me when things settled down. But Abel died in a motorcycle accident 2 weeks after Nancy discovered she was pregnant. And Diana Davenport saw it as a perfect opportunity to get rid of the nanny she considered a threat to her authority over her own son. She accused me of seducing Abel to get money from the family. She said the child I was carrying was a gold-digging bastard who would never be recognized by the Davenports. She threatened me in a way." Nancy paused, trembling with the memory. "How did she threaten you, Mom?" "She said that if I didn't disappear immediately, she would make sure that neither I nor my daughter would ever find peace anywhere. That she would use all the family's power to destroy our lives wherever we went." But what truly terrified Nancy were not the direct threats. It was the mysterious death of Diana Davenport just 2 weeks after that conversation. How did she die? "A domestic accident, that's what they said. She fell down the stairs of the mansion and hit her head. But I was there that night, daughter. I saw—" Nancy's voice broke and she needed several minutes to compose herself before continuing. "I saw Abel's father, Richard Davenport, arguing with Diana in the library. He was David's father's older brother, the real head of the company at the time. They were fighting about something related to me, about family secrets. I heard shouting, the sound of a struggle, and then silence. Nancy had gone down to investigate and found Diana lying at the foot of the stairs, her neck broken. Richard was standing next to the body, but when he saw Nancy, his eyes filled with a coldness that terrified her. He told me I had 2 options: disappear that very night and never come back, or be charged with murder. He said the security cameras would show I was alone with Diana when she died. And you ran. With the clothes on my back and the money I had saved. I came upstate, changed my last name, invented a story about being a widow. I raised you far away from all that, thinking we were safe." Eleanor was silent for a long time, absorbing everything she had heard. Finally, she looked up at her mother. "Richard Davenport is David's uncle." "He was. He died a few years ago. That's why I thought we were safe, that you could work at the company. So David and I are not siblings. No, dear, you have no blood relation. But that doesn't mean you're safe. The Davenport family has long tentacles, and Helen Sinclair—" "What does Helen have to do with this?" Nancy hesitated, as if she were revealing the last and most dangerous secret. "Helen Sinclair is Richard Davenport's niece, the daughter of his sister, who married Senator Sinclair. She grew up hearing stories about me, about the gold-digging nanny who almost destroyed the family. When she found out about your involvement with David, Eleanor's world spun. It all made sense now. Helen's particular hatred, The efficiency with which she had destroyed her life, the ease with which she had manipulated the evidence. She knew who I was from the beginning. Probably. And she was waiting for an opportunity to finish what her uncle started 20 years ago. Eleanor stood up abruptly, took David's letter, and showed it to her mother. He wants to meet me. He says he's discovered things about our past. Nancy turned pale when she saw the letter. Don't go, dear. Please don't go. If you get involved with him again... I'm already involved, Mom, I always have been. And now I know it wasn't our fault. Against all her mother's advice and Ethan's concerns, Eleanor drove to the Catskills the following Saturday. The cafe was on a quiet street in the center of the tourist town, a discreet place where two fugitives could talk without being recognized. She arrived a few minutes before the scheduled time and chose a table at the back of the establishment. Her hands trembled as she waited, and several times she almost got up to leave. When David entered the cafe, Eleanor felt as if all the air had been sucked out of her lungs. He looked different, thinner with deep dark circles under his eyes, his hair longer and more unkempt. He wore dark jeans and a simple shirt, a far cry from the impeccable suits he had always worn. He looked like someone who hadn't slept properly in months. He saw her immediately and walked to her table with hesitant steps. When he got close, they just looked at each other for a moment that seemed to last for hours. You came, he finally said, his voice hoarse with emotion. I shouldn't have. But you did. David sat across from her, keeping his hands on the table away from her, as if he feared any touch might break the fragile moment. How did you find me? It wasn't hard. Small town, a new pretty employee working at the nursing home. He tried to smile, but couldn't. Eleanor, I know you have no reason to listen to me, but you need to know the truth about what happened. I know a lot more about the truth than you think. His response surprised him. There was a firmness in her voice he didn't recognize, a maturity that made her even more beautiful and yet more distant. Did your mother tell you about her past? Everything. About Diana, about Richard, about how your family destroyed her life. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. And about Helen. David closed his eyes, feeling the weight of decades of lies crashing down on him. So you know we're not siblings. Yes, I know. They fell silent, absorbing the relief and pain that this revelation brought. They weren't siblings, but that didn't erase everything that had happened between them. Eleanor, I didn't know any of this. About what my uncle did to your mother. About Helen being part of the family. About the frame-up. But you didn't defend me. The words came out as an accusation, laden with all the pain she had carried for the past few months. When they accused me, when they humiliated me, you stayed silent. I didn't know right away. By the time I found out, you had already disappeared. You're the owner of the company. How did you not know an employee had been accused of theft? Because Helen controlled the entire situation. The security guards reported to her, not to me. She said it was better to handle it discreetly to avoid a scandal. When I finally found out, David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration she knew well. I moved heaven and earth looking for you. I hired investigators, offered rewards, but you had completely vanished. And why does it matter now? Eleanor asked, though her heart was racing. Why look for me after all this time? Because I found out Helen isn't finished. She's still after you. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean? David took a folder from the bag he had brought and opened it on the table. Inside were photos, documents, phone records. Helen hired investigators to locate you and your mother. They've known where you are for weeks, and there are indications that she's planning something. The photos showed Eleanor leaving work, entering her house, talking with Ethan. There was even a photo of her with her boyfriend. Embracing at the entrance of a movie theater. How did you get this? I have my own investigators now. When I found out what Helen did, I started tracking her, and I discovered she's obsessed with finishing what her uncle started. Eleanor looked at the photos with growing horror. Her life, her privacy, everything had been invaded again. What does she want? To make sure you never tell the truth about the past. And most importantly, to make sure you never get close to me again. But I'm with Ethan. I'm trying to move on. David looked at the photo of her with her boyfriend, and Eleanor saw pain in his eyes. Does he make you happy? The question was like a stab, because the honest answer was no. Ethan was kind, caring, everything she should want. But she couldn't love him. Not in the way he deserved. Not in the way she still loved the man sitting across from her. That doesn't matter anymore. It matters to me. The silence that followed was heavy with everything they weren't saying. With all the unresolved love, all the unhealed pain, all the future they had lost because of other people's lies. "David," Eleanor whispered, finally looking into his eyes. "What do you want from me?" "I want to protect you. I want Helen to pay for what she did. And I want—" He hesitated, as if the next words were too dangerous to be spoken. "I want a chance to start over." Start over? A chance to do things right this time. No lies, no secrets, no powerful families trying to tear us apart. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face. "You think it's that simple? That we can just forget everything that happened?" "No, I don't think it's simple. I think it will be the hardest thing we've ever done. But I think it's worth trying." He reached his hand across the table, waiting. It was the same choice she had faced that night of the blackout. Accepting that hand meant crossing a line from which there would be no return. But this time, she knew the price. This time, she knew exactly what she was choosing, and for the first time in months, Eleanor reached out and touched his hand. The touch was electric, familiar, like coming home after a long journey. And when David intertwined his fingers with hers, they both knew that despite everything that had happened, what was between them was still alive. Now they had to find out if it was strong enough to survive what was yet to come. The days following the meeting in the Catskills were an emotional roller coaster for Eleanor. David had insisted she not return home immediately, that Helen might be watching, waiting for any sign that they had met. So she stayed at a hotel in town for 3 days, telling Ethan she was visiting a sick aunt. During that time, David filled her in on everything he had discovered about Helen's manipulations, about the web of corruption that involved part of the family business, about how his own mother had died, and most importantly, about how he had lost control of everything because he hadn't paid attention to the signs. Helen was always there, he told her, as they walked along an isolated mountain trail. Ever since we met in college, she positioned herself as the perfect fiancée, the obvious choice for someone in my position. I never questioned it, never thought there could be hidden motives. And your company? What's really happening? It's being destroyed from the inside. Sabotage contracts, leaked information, key employees being bought out by the competition. All very well orchestrated to look like my incompetence. Eleanor stopped walking and turned to him. You think Helen is behind this too? I'm certain of it. She's creating a situation where I'll be forced to sell the company to cover the debts. And guess who's positioned to make a generous offer through shell companies? Her father. Exactly. Senator Sinclair. They've been planning to absorb the Davenports for years, just waiting for the right opportunity. As David revealed the extent of the conspiracy against him, Eleanor wrestled with her own internal conflicts. Being near him again awakened all the feelings she had tried to bury. Every glance, every casual touch, every moment of complicity reminded her of why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. But there was also guilt. Guilt for being there when Ethan was waiting for her at home, worried, offering all the sincere love she couldn't properly return. On the last night before she returned, as they were having dinner in a small, discreet restaurant, David finally asked the question he had been avoiding. Do you love him? Eleanor didn't have to ask who he was talking about. She put her fork down on her plate and sighed deeply. Ethan is a wonderful man. Kind, honest, treats me like a princess. He's everything any sensible woman should want. That doesn't answer my question. She looked him in the eyes, and for the first time she was completely honest. No, I don't love him. Not in the way he deserves, not in the way he loves me. I try, God knows I try, but I can't get you out of my heart, no matter how much I should. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with all the pain and unresolved desire from months of separation. David reached across the table and touched her hand gently. Eleanor, I know I have no right to ask for anything after everything that's happened. But if you give me a chance, a real chance, I promise this time will be different. How can you promise that? Your life, your world, so they're too complicated for someone like me. My life is falling apart, he said with a sincerity that surprised her. The company, the family, everything I thought defined who I was is unraveling. And you know what? For the first time, I don't care, because I've discovered that none of it matters if you're not with me. Eleanor felt tears forming in her eyes. David, I'll give it all up. The presidency, the inheritance, everything. Helen can have the rotten empire if she wants. We'll go far away, start from scratch, build something of our own. You would do that? Fiercement for you. I'd do anything. When she returned home the next day, Eleanor was emotionally exhausted. She found Ethan waiting for her at the door with flowers and a relieved smile. You had me worried, he said, hugging her affectionately. How's your aunt? Better. Much better. In the days that followed, Eleanor tried to return to normal but found it impossible. Everything had changed. Her perspective, her priorities, her feelings. She looked at Ethan and saw a good man who deserved so much more than she could give. She saw her own life as a lie built on the fear of facing the truth. It was on a Thursday, while she was working at the nursing home, that everything began to fall apart. Ethan showed up during her shift, nervous, sweating, with an expression she had never seen on his face before. We need to talk, now. He took her to a nearby cafe, and there, with trembling hands, he told her the truth she had never suspected. Eleanor, I didn't meet you by chance in that library. The words hit her like a hammer to the stomach. What do you mean? I was hired. By Helen Sinclair. She paid me to get close to you, to win your trust, to keep you monitored. Eleanor's world collapsed for the second time in less than a year. She looked at the man she had considered her savior, her chance at normalcy, and saw a stranger. How long? 30 years, from the beginning. Since you arrived here. Was it all a lie? The books, the conversations, the kisses? All of it? Ethan ran his hands through his hair, clearly tormented. At first, yes. It was just a job. Helen knew you would eventually try to rebuild your life, and she wanted someone she trusted nearby to report your movements. And after? After I fell in love, for real. That's why I'm here confessing everything, because I can't live with this lie anymore. Eleanor stood up abruptly, feeling nauseous. You reported everything to her? Our conversations, our dates? Yes, but never anything intimate. Never anything that could hurt you directly. And for the last few weeks, I stopped reporting completely. The last few weeks, Eleanor felt her blood run cold. Did you tell her about my trip to the Catskills? Ethan's silence was answer enough. Oh my God, she whispered. My God, what have you done? Eleanor, forgive me. I know I don't deserve it, but I really fell in love with you. I want to protect you. I want to... You handed me over to her, Eleanor shouted, drawing curious stares from the other customers. You handed me over to the woman who already destroyed my life once. She ran out of the cafe, ignoring Ethan's shouts behind her. She had to warn David, had to tell him that Helen knew everything, that their meeting had been discovered. But when she got home, she found her mother passed out in the kitchen, surrounded by broken glass and a crumpled letter on the floor. Nancy had been hospitalized with a severe anxiety attack, and the letter that had caused the collapse was from Helen Sinclair. Dear Nancy, the letter read with venomous courtesy. I thought you might like to know that your daughter has been meeting with David Davenport again. Clearly you two didn't learn your lesson the first time. But don't worry, this time the solution will be permanent. Eleanor immediately called David, but the phone went straight to voicemail. She tried his office, but the secretary said he hadn't come in that day, that no one knew where he was. Panic took hold of her. Helen knew everything and was taking action. David was in danger, and it was her fault. That night in the hospital where her mother was admitted, Eleanor made a decision. She would no longer hide, no longer be a passive victim of Helen's power games. If they wanted a war, she would give them one. She called every number she could find related to the New York press. She told her story, the whole story, without omitting anything. The connection between Helen and Richard Davenport, the mysterious death of Diana, the frame-up that had destroyed her life, everything. And most importantly, she told them about the documents David had gathered on the corruption in the company, about how Helen was sabotaging the empire from within. The story exploded in the media 2 days later. Political heiress in blackmail and murder scandal. The truth behind the fall of the Davenport empire, how a fiancé plotted to destroy her future husband to steal his fortune. Helen tried to deny it, but the documents were too solid, the evidence too well connected. Senator Sinclair was forced to temporarily step down from his position to avoid a larger scandal. But the price of exposure was high. Helen, cornered, decided to accelerate her final plans. David was found unconscious in his apartment, the victim of an overdose of medication he didn't take. If it weren't for the housekeeper, who had a key and found him, he would have died. In the hospital, while David fought for his life, the doctors found something else. Signs of drugs that had been administered without his knowledge for weeks, explaining the deterioration of his health and judgment in recent months. Helen had been slowly poisoning him, setting the stage for what was supposed to look like a suicide, motivated by the pressure of his failing business. When Eleanor arrived at the hospital in New York, after a desperate 6-hour drive without stopping, she found David unconscious, hooked up to machines, fighting to survive. She sat by his bed and held his hand, whispering words of encouragement, telling him how she had exposed Helen, how the truth had finally come to light. "You can't die now," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Not when we're finally free to be together. Not when I can finally tell you that I love you without fear." That's when David squeezed her hand slightly. He opened his eyes slowly, focusing on her face with difficulty. "Eleanor?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'm here. I'm here, and I'm not leaving your side again. Helen, she's in prison, charged with attempted murder, blackmail, forgery. It's over, David. She can't hurt us anymore." David tried to smile, but he was still too weak. "You came." "Of course I came. You are my greatest love and my greatest pain. I wasn't going to let you face this alone. And Ethan, it's over." I couldn't live a lie anymore. David used all his strength to lift his hand and touch her face. "I love you," he whispered. "I've always loved you. I love you too. More than I should. More than is sensible, more than anything." When they kissed there in the hospital room, it wasn't the desperate kiss of the first time, nor the hesitant kiss of their reunion. It was the kiss of two people who had finally found their way back to each other, after journeying through the hell of others' lies and manipulations. But there was still one last revelation, one final truth that would change everything they thought they knew about their families, and the reason they had been so cruelly separated. And that truth would come from a source neither of them expected. Helen, who from prison decided that if she was going to lose everything, she would take all the secrets down with her. What she revealed in police interrogations about Diana Davenport's death and the true motives behind decades of family manipulation would leave both Eleanor and David breathless, and it would finally explain why their love had been considered so dangerous that people were willing to kill to prevent. Yet Helen began to talk in her third week of pre-trial detention, when it became clear there would be no bail, and that the evidence against her was overwhelming. Sitting in the interrogation room, her hair disheveled and without the perfect makeup she had always worn as a mask, she finally looked like what she really was, a desperate woman who had lost everything. The prosecutor in charge of the case was present, as were David's lawyers, and a private investigator Eleanor had hired with her savings. Helen looked at each of them with a mixture of contempt and resignation before she began to speak. "You think you know the whole story," she said, her voice still arrogant despite the circumstances. "But you have no idea of the truth behind all this." "Then tell us," said the prosecutor, adjusting the recorder. Helen smiled bitterly. "Diana Davenport didn't die because she found out about Nancy's pregnancy. She died because she discovered something much worse." The room fell completely silent. "Richard, my uncle, didn't kill Diana out of anger or to protect the family's reputation. He killed her because she had discovered that the son she raised as her first husband's was not his son." The world stopped for everyone in the room. "David?" whispered his lawyer. "Diana was barren," Helen continued, as if telling a children's story. "After years of trying to conceive, she and her husband turned to a surrogate, a young woman from a poor family who agreed to carry the child in exchange for money. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in a terrifying way. David's biological mother was Nancy Nascimento. The silence that followed was sepulchral. Helen continued, now clearly enjoying the shock she had caused. "Diana raised David as her son for 7 years, but when Nancy returned as a nanny, she saw the truth. The boy looked more and more like his biological mother. The same eyes, the same curve of the lips, small details that only a mother would notice. And when Diana discovered Nancy's natural pregnancy. She realized that Nancy would give birth to a daughter who would be David's full biological sister, the same mother, the same sperm donor who had been used in the artificial insemination years before. The revelation fell like a bomb in the hearts of everyone present. Eleanor and David were in fact siblings, blood siblings who had fallen in love without knowing their connection. Diana went mad with this discovery, Helen continued. She threatened to expose everything, destroy the family's reputation, tell David he was the son of a surrogate. Richard couldn't allow that, not just for the reputation, but because it would jeopardize the entire succession structure of the company. So he killed her. And he forced Nancy to disappear, promising that if she said anything, both she and the daughter she was carrying would die. Nancy left believing she was protecting Eleanor, never imagining she was separating two siblings who would one day meet. David's lawyer was pale, taking furious notes. "How do you know all this?" "Richard told me before he died. He wanted someone in the family to know the truth, in case we ever needed to use this information to protect the family assets." "And what did you use this information for?" Helen laughed bitterly. "To prevent two siblings from committing incest and jeopardizing the entire financial structure my family had spent decades building. I thought I was doing the right thing." When the news reached the hospital where David was still recovering from the effects of the poisoning, Eleanor was by his side, reading a book aloud. She had practically moved into his room, sleeping in the uncomfortable armchair, refusing to leave him alone. The lawyer entered the room with an expression that immediately alerted them that something was wrong. "I need to speak with you about Helen's revelations." When he finished telling them everything Helen had revealed, David and Eleanor just looked at each other, slowly absorbing the magnitude of the truth. They were siblings. Blood siblings who had fallen madly in love with each other. "This changes everything," Eleanor whispered, tears beginning to stream down her face. "Does it?" David asked, his voice still weak but laden with emotion. "How could it not? We're siblings, David, real siblings." David struggled to sit up in bed, ignoring the pain and weakness. "Eleanor, look at me." She looked up, and he saw in her eyes all the pain and confusion he was feeling. "Do you think this changes what I feel for you?" "It should, but does it?" Eleanor closed her eyes, fighting against feelings she couldn't control. "No," she whispered. "It should, but it doesn't. Not for me either. I know it's wrong, I know society considers it unacceptable, but I can't tear you from my heart." They were silent for a long time, each lost in their own thoughts, trying to process the impossibility of their situation. That's when a nurse entered the room with a strange expression. "Sorry to interrupt, but there's a lady here who insists on speaking with you. She says it's crucial that she has information about your family." The woman who entered the room was elderly, with grey hair and kind eyes. Eleanor recognized her immediately as the head nurse from the nursing home where she worked. "Celeste? What are you doing here?" The woman approached the bed, looking alternately at Eleanor and David with an expression that mixed sadness and relief. "My dear, I couldn't stay silent any longer after everything I saw on television about you two." "Silent about what?" Celeste sighed deeply. "I knew your mother, Eleanor. Nancy and I were great friends in our youth. I was there when she came back from New York, pregnant and terrified. And I know the truth about who your father is." The world stopped again. Richard Davenport hired Nancy to be a surrogate for Diana, but that's a lie. Nancy was never a surrogate for anyone. "What do you mean?" "Your mother was raped by Richard Davenport." The words fell like a death sentence in the silent room. Nancy worked as a cleaner in the company's office before being hired as a nanny. Richard abused her several times over months, threatening to fire her and destroy her life if she told anyone. Eleanor brought a hand to her mouth, feeling nauseous. When she became pregnant, Richard saw a perfect opportunity. Diana really was barren and was desperate for a child. He convinced his wife they had found the perfect surrogate, without ever telling her that he was the child's biological father. "David is Richard's son," Eleanor whispered, "and so are you, my dear. Two children of the same rapist, raised without knowing their connection. That's why Diana went mad when she noticed the resemblance between you. It wasn't because you were siblings from Nancy, but because you were siblings from Richard. The revelation changed everything again, but this time in an even more disturbing way. They were siblings, but children of a rapist, united by a trauma their mothers had carried in secret for decades. "Why did my mother never tell me?" Eleanor asked, crying. "Because she loves you. Because she wanted to protect you from the truth about how you were conceived. And because Richard threatened to kill her if she ever revealed that he was your father." David was as pale as a ghost. "Richard was my father," he said, more to himself than to anyone. "My uncle was my father." "And he killed the woman who raised him to protect that secret," Celeste said sadly. "Diana Davenport may have been cold and distant, but she didn't deserve to die for discovering the truth." In the days that followed, the final revelation about Richard's paternity exploded in the media with even more force than the previous revelations. The Davenport empire, already shaken by scandals, collapsed completely. Stocks plummeted, contracts were cancelled, investigations were opened into decades of corruption and abuse of power. Helen, in trying to protect what she considered the family assets, had inadvertently destroyed everything. David officially renounced any claim to the Davenport inheritance. He handed the company over to creditors and completely stepped away from the corporate world that had defined his life until that moment. Eleanor struggled with the discovery of her origin, with the knowledge that she existed because of a terrible crime committed against her mother. But she also struggled with the fact that, even knowing they were siblings, even knowing the horrific circumstances of their conceptions, she couldn't stop loving David. When her mother was discharged from the hospital and came to visit her, Eleanor gently confronted her with the truth. "Why did you never tell me about Richard?" she asked, holding her mother's hands. Nancy cried for a long time before answering. "How could I tell my daughter she exists because a powerful man forced himself on me? How could I look at you so beautiful, so pure, and remind you of the horror that brought you into the world? But I had the right to know, perhaps, but I had the right to protect you. And for 23 years I managed to do that. And now, what do we do now?" Nancy looked at her daughter with a weary wisdom. "Now you have to decide what love means to you, whether it's something that can be defined by the rules of others, or if it's something that transcends those rules. But we're siblings. You are two people who love each other, and were victims of the horrific choices of men who are now dead. What you do with that love is your decision." The conversation Eleanor had with David that night was the most difficult of their lives. "We can't be together," she said, though every word hurt like a stab. "As much as we love each other, as unfair as it is, we can't." "Why?" David asked. "Because society says it's wrong. Because we were conceived by a monster. Because we found out too late that we're siblings. For all those reasons. Eleanor, I love you more than my own life. This love wasn't born yesterday. It's not based on a fleeting passion. I loved you before I knew we were siblings, and I love you after knowing. This love has survived lies, manipulation, separation, attempted murder. Do you really think it should die because of a biological detail?" "A biological detail? David, we're siblings. We are two people who found each other in a cruel world and found salvation in one another. We are two victims of the same monsters who leaned on each other to survive. What else matters besides that?" Eleanor cried because he was right and wrong at the same time, because loving him was the most natural and the most forbidden thing in the world. "What if we have children?" "What if? Then we won't have biological children. We'll adopt, if we want to be parents. Or we'll simply live our love without worrying about anything other than being happy. People will know. They'll judge. People have already judged us. They've already tried to destroy us for much lesser reasons. And still we survived." David moved closer to her, took her hands. "Eleanor, I can live without many things. I can live without money, without status, without social recognition. But I've discovered I can't live without you. And if that makes us outcasts, if it forces us to live far away from the world that judges us, then so be it. You would sacrifice everything for me? I've already sacrificed everything for you. The difference is that now I know it's worth it." They made love that night for the first time since their reunion. It wasn't the desperate passion of the first time, nor the guilty hesitation of discovering their kinship. It was the complete surrender of two people who had decided that their love was stronger than any social convention, purer than any external judgment. When they woke up the next day in each other's arms, they knew they had definitively crossed the line that separated them from the rest of the world. 2 months later, they left the United States. They bought a small farm in an isolated valley in New Zealand, far from journalists, far from judgment, far from everything that had defined their lives up to that point. David used the money he had managed to get from selling some personal properties before the company's total collapse. Eleanor brought only her clothes and a few books. Nancy chose to stay in the States. She said she was too old to start over in another country, but she blessed her daughter's decision. "Make each other happy," she said at the airport. "Make something beautiful of your lives, to make up for all the ugliness that was used to keep you apart." In New Zealand, David and Eleanor registered as married under different names. He became David Silver, a former American executive who had decided to try his hand at farming. She became Elena Silver, a freelance journalist who wrote articles about sustainability and rural life. They created a simple, beautiful life. They raised sheep, planted a garden, renovated the old house with their own hands. On winter nights, they read together in front of the fireplace. In the summers, they hiked the trails of the mountains that surrounded their property, and they loved each other. They loved each other with the intensity of those who know that every day together is a victory against a world that tried to tear them apart. 3 years later, they adopted 2 siblings from a local orphanage. Emma, 7, and Thomas, 5, children whose parents had died in an accident, children who needed love and stability, as much as David and Eleanor once had. They never returned to the United States. They never missed the life they had left behind. Sometimes on sunny afternoons, when David was working in the garden and Eleanor was writing on the porch while the children played in the yard, they would look at each other and remember how it all began, with a spilled bucket of water and a pair of wet shoes. And whenever the memory returned to that first time, he had whispered, "Don't move, it will hurt more." David would smile and call to Eleanor. "What is it?" she would ask, coming closer. "You can move now," he would whisper, as he did now every time he remembered. "It doesn't hurt anymore." And she would smile because it was true. Finally, after so much suffering, so much struggle, so much pain, they had found a place where they could move freely, where they could love without fear, where they could simply be happy. They had discovered that true love is not defined by the rules of the world.